You're ripping me!
Hello everyone. In this video we will learn the basics of SVG. Now before we worry about what SVG is, let's first just look at a demo of the finished product that we will be building together. Alright, so here we see perhaps the finest drawing of a cat in the history of art. And here we see a few buttons. The first button reads move around, and if I click it, you can see the cat starts moving around, his whiskers start twitching, his eyes start moving. And notice that his eyes are currently green, but if I click this button that says blue eyes, now he has blue eyes. Also notice that he's currently smiling, but if I click this button that says sad, now he's frowning. Alright, so this is what we're going to learn how to build in this video. It may not be the most practical example in the world, but I promise it will teach you the basics of working with SVG on the web. Let's get started. Alright, so what is SVG? SVG is an image or graphic format. So we know that JPEG is an image format, GIF is another image format, PNG or PNG is an image format, right? So there are all kinds of different image formats, and SVG is one of them. Now, SVG is fundamentally different from these other image formats because SVG is the only one that is vector-based. The letters SVG stand for Scalable Vector Graphics, and the key word there is vector. Now, instead of trying to explain what vector means, let me show you what vector means. So currently I have open a tool that will let me create an SVG file directly in my web browser. Now I want you to follow along with me on your computer, so right now pause the video and Google for SVG edit GitHub. The top result should take you to this GitHub overview page, and if you just scroll down a bit and click on this link, that will take you to this editor. Alright, so with this open, we are now on the same page, and let's create an SVG file or illustration together. Let's not worry about drawing a cat or anything in particular yet. Let's just add a few random shapes to our drawing as an experiment. So over in the left-hand sidebar, if I click this red oval, now within the center canvas area, I can click and drag to create an oval. And if I wanted it to be blue instead of red, down here I can click the fill tool and choose any color I'd like. Perfect. Alright, next let's imagine I want to add a rectangle to the drawing. So over in the sidebar I can click the rectangle tool. Alright, and let's imagine I want it to be orange. Now I realize you're not watching this video to learn about your shapes and colors, right? So we've all graduated preschool. The reason I'm showing you this is because now, if we click this icon towards the top left that reads SVG, we can see the code that our drawing is made up of. So for example, this ellipse element, that's the blue oval. This rect element, that's the rectangle. This code defines the size of each shape, the positioning of each shape, the color. You get the idea. Alright, so if we delete this ellipse element from the code and then click OK, that deletes the blue oval. So now we can see the relationship between our drawing and SVG code. Now I do want to point out that we are not limited to basic shapes like ovals and rectangles. We can use the path tool to draw our own custom shapes. So in the sidebar, I'll click the path tool. And now I can click anywhere in the canvas to create the first point for my path. Alright, now when I click to create the second point in my path, I can hold down and drag to create a smooth curved line. And I can create as many different points as I want. So I can click here again and then drag to create the curve. And you don't have to drag. So if I wanted to create straight lines like you would see in a traditional polygon, I can just click, 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 you get the idea. And then I'll click back on my first point to complete this path. And there we have it. We just drew our own custom shape. Let's imagine I want this to be green instead of orange. So I click on it, click the fill color. And let's also imagine I don't want the black outline or stroke for this shape. So down here, I'll reduce the stroke or outline from 5 to 0. Perfect. Now the reason I'm showing you this is because now if we click that SVG icon in the top again to view the code, we can see that the custom shape we just drew is created with a path element. And this code keeps track of all of the different points and angles that we created. All right, now let's imagine that we are happy with our drawing and we want to add it to a web page. So here's how I would do that. I would click this SVG icon. I would copy all of the code, 100% of this code, into my clipboard. I'd jump over to my text editor on my computer in a brand new file, an empty file. I'd paste in my clipboard. I'd save this as a brand new file, and I can name it anything I'd like. Let's call it drawing dot, and then instead of a JPEG image, this is an SVG image. All right, so now I have a new file named drawing.svg, and now I'm free to use that in an HTML file. So here's an example bare bones HTML file that I have ready. This is what it currently looks like in the web browser. So you can create something like this on your computer to follow along, but underneath this heading, I can just create an image element. And we know that the image element uses the source attribute. And then we can just point towards drawing.svg. Save this, refresh it. Okay, so now that we've seen an example of SVG in action, let's stop for a minute and talk about what vector actually means. So vector graphics are all about polygons or shapes instead of pixels. This means that we cannot use vector graphics for photographs, but we can use vector graphics for illustrations, right? So things like logos, icons, or anything that we would create with shapes. Now, the biggest advantage of vector graphics is that they can scale infinitely. So you can zoom in or enlarge an SVG image to any size and it remains perfectly crisp, perfectly sharp. And this is because it's just polygons and shapes described through mathematics. And this is the complete opposite of most other graphic formats like JPEG, GIF, or PNG. Those image formats are raster based instead of vector based. So here is an example of a raster graphic. This is a JPEG photograph. And if I zoom in really closely, you can see the grid of each individual square pixel. Now this is all the data that this photograph will ever contain. So if we tried to enlarge the photo, we would just be stretching and blurring the same amount of pixels. All right, and this is an example of a raster graphic. But again, with vector graphics, it's just mathematics describing shapes, so it's super flexible, super dynamic. Another big advantage of SVG is that we can manipulate it on the fly in the web browser with CSS. So let's give ourselves a quick example goal. Let's imagine that when we hover over this image, we want the custom green shape to become blue instead and to also shrink in size a bit. So first, if we want to be able to manipulate our drawing with CSS, instead of loading an external SVG file like this, we need to include the SVG code directly in our HTML page. Let me show you what I mean. So let me go into the SVG file that we created just a moment ago. Let me copy this to my clipboard. And then back in our HTML, we can just delete this image element and replace it by simply pasting in our clipboard with the SVG code. So if I save this HTML file and reload the page, we see the exact same result, only now we can manipulate these shapes with our CSS. So we know that this path element is our custom green shape, so I'm just going to give it a class of my shape, and then I can reference this class name in my CSS. So let me open up my CSS file for this website. Let's create a new rule. My shape, and if I want to change the color, I can just say fill, let's say blue, save that, refresh it, and if I only wanted it to be blue when the image gets hovered over, I could just change this selector to SVG hover, space, and then my class name. So now it's green, but if I hover over the image, it's blue. All right, and if I wanted the shape to shrink a bit in size when we hover it, I can just use the transform property and use the scale function. Now a value of 1 will leave the shape at its current natural size. So if we want to shrink it a bit, we could try 0.9. All right, you can see it shrinks a bit. And if we want it to shrink gradually instead of just all at once in 1 millisecond, we can target the myShape class and say transition. We want to target that transform property, and we want it to smoothly transition over the course of maybe half of a second. So 0.5 seconds. So now when I hover, you can see the transition is smooth. And we could also have the green to blue color swap happen smoothly by saying that we want to transition all properties. So the transform property and the fill color property. And instead of half a second, let's try 1.3 seconds just to make it dramatic. So now when I hover, it's very smooth and we see the color transitions as well. All right, now at this point, we have a general understanding of what SVG is and why it's useful. Now let's change gears and forget about this example drawing, and instead, let's start working on our animated cat project. Now, I'm not going to draw the cat illustration on camera. That would eat up too much time. So instead, I have the cat SVG drawing file here on my desktop, and I will include a link in the description to this cat drawing SVG code. The link will be to CodePen or to my website, so you can just copy and paste all of this SVG code and follow along with me. All right, so feel free to pause the video in just a couple of seconds so you can do that. But I'm going to copy and paste all of this cat SVG drawing code, copy it to my clipboard, and then back in the demo HTML file we've been working with, I'm going to delete the SVG that we had that just had the example custom shapes, and I'll paste in my clipboard with all of the cat drawing. All right, so if I save this, once I refresh, this custom drawing will be gone and replaced with the cat. All right, so we have our cat illustration. Now we want to animate and manipulate it with CSS and JavaScript. Now, if you'd rather create your own new drawing of something else and animate that instead, please feel free to do that. I do want to clarify that you do not need to use this online SVG edit tool that I showed you. In the real world, the most popular vector graphic editor is Adobe Illustrator. Illustrator is far and away the industry standard. There's also another popular vector-based app named Sketch, but both of these programs, Illustrator and Sketch, cost money and not everyone has access to them. This is why I initially recommended this online SVG edit tool, because it's a nice free alternative. But anyways, if you'd rather create your own drawing instead of using my cat, long story short, feel free to use any vector graphic software you please, because all of the modern programs have great export as SVG functionality nowadays. Having said that, let's get back to our cat example. Let's get started by adding buttons the user can click that will change the cat's eye color. So in our HTML, right underneath this heading level 1 and before the SVG graphic, let's add a new div that has a class of buttons. And then within that div, let's add one button that reads blue eyes and another button that reads green eyes. All right, now let's use JavaScript so that when we click this button, we add a blue eyes class to the SVG element. And when we click this button, we remove the class. So for example, if we look at our HTML, here is the SVG element. You can see on the opening overall SVG tag, I already have a class named cat, and we can just go ahead and give it a secondary class of blue eyes. Okay, now before we even write any JavaScript to handle the button click events, let's manually hard code this class, like I just did here. And let's write a bit of corresponding CSS. So over in my CSS file, we can delete these rules from our example earlier in the lesson. We don't need them. All right, so let's create a new rule that targets the blue eyes class. And then within that SVG element, I want to look for a descendant or child element named eye color. You may be wondering about this eye color class. And if I jump back to my HTML, within the SVG code for the cat drawing, you'll notice that I already found the ellipse elements that represent the cat's eye color and gave them each, the left eye and the right eye, a class of eye color. All right, so back in our CSS, If the overall SVG element has a class of blue eyes, then we want to go into the cat drawing, find the specific eye color ellipse or ovals, and then change their fill color to a blue shade. Let's save this and refresh the page. And now that we see that that did indeed work, the eyes are blue, we can remove that hard-coded blue eyes class from the HTML. So on the SVG opening tag, I'm going to remove the blue eyes class because now we can set up JavaScript to add and remove that blue eyes class on the fly based on our button click events. All right, so let's change gears and begin writing JavaScript. So you'll notice that at the bottom of my HTML file, right before the closing body tag, I'm including a JavaScript file. So I'm saying look in a folder named JS and then load main.js. So let's open up that file. Currently it's completely empty, so this way you and I can write all of the code together so we're on the same page. If you are completely unfamiliar with JavaScript and you've never even included a JavaScript file on your HTML page before, the following part of the video is probably going to move way too fast for you. So if that's the case, I recommend you first watch my JavaScript in half an hour video. That video should get you up to speed so that the rest of this video will make perfect sense. Having said that, let's keep things rolling. So the first thing I want to do in JavaScript is create a variable. I'll name it buttons, but you can name it anything you'd like. And I want this variable to simply be a selection or collection of all of the button elements on our page. So if we look at our HTML structure, we see that the buttons live within a div that has a class of buttons. So if I want to select these elements in JavaScript, I can just say document, query, selector, all, and then I can just use a CSS-like or jQuery-like selector. So we'll say go inside the buttons div, and then grab any button elements. Okay, so now we have a buttons variable that's a collection of those elements. We will reuse this in just a moment. But first, let's create another variable named cat that simply points towards the main SVG overall element. So in my JavaScript, I'll say var cat equals document get elements by class name. Because remember, the SVG element has a class of cat, so that's how I'm going to select it with JavaScript. So look for an element that has a class of cat, and because this returns a collection of elements, as in multiple elements, we can just say 0. So using array notation, we can just say give us the first element in this collection. Okay, next, let's set up event handling for all of the buttons so that when they get clicked, we can actually do something in response. So to be on the lookout for incoming clicks on the button elements, I'm going to use a for loop. All right, and what I'm going to do is loop through this collection of all of the button elements and then do something for each one. So in the parentheses of our for loop, we'll say I equals 0. Again, if this doesn't make sense, after you watch my JavaScript in half an hour video, this will make sense. But having said that, let's keep rolling. So then we'll say as long as I is less than the length of this collection or the length of this array. Well, this technically isn't an array, but for all intensive purposes, in this case, we can treat it like it is an array. So we can say as long as I is less than buttons.length, then we want to increment I by 1. Okay, and then within our for loop, what do we want to actually happen for each button? We want to add an event listener so that we're on the lookout for incoming click events. So we'll look inside our buttons collection. We'll use our I counter variable, and then we'll just say add event listener. And the event that we're listening for is the click event. And the second argument that this function is looking for is a function to run in response to the click event. So let's just create a brand new function. We will do that in just a few seconds, and we will name that brand new function manage cat classes. You can name it anything you'd like, but that's what I'm going with. Let's add a semicolon at the end of this line. All right, next, let's go ahead and actually create that function named manage cat classes. So we'll say function manage cat classes. And before we write the real code for this function, let's first make sure that our click events are working as we expect. So within this function, we can just add a test alert pop-up message that says testing 1, 2, 3. So let's save this and refresh the page and click one of the buttons. Perfect. So we know that our event listener is working correctly. We see the testing 1, 2, 3 message. So back in our JavaScript, we can delete this line because we don't actually want to alert out the test message. What we actually want to do is add the class of blue eyes if we click this button, and we want to remove the class of blue eyes if we click this button. Now I know that by the end of this project, we are going to have way more than just 2 buttons. So I want to set things up so that our JavaScript is not super repetitive. So let me show you how I'm going to do things. In our HTML, on the blue eyes button, let's add a data attribute named data add, and it will have a value of blue eyes. And on the green eyes button, let's add a data attribute named data remove and give it a value of blue eyes as well. All right, and now we can access these values in our JavaScript. So back in our JS file, within our function that runs whenever a button gets clicked, let's target the cat SVG element. Remember, we set up a variable named cat just for that purpose. And then we are going to access its class list. And we want to add a new class to the element. And what's the name of the class that we want to add? Well, it's simply the value of the data add attribute. So back in our JavaScript, within the parentheses for this add class function, we can target the specific button element that got clicked by using the this keyword. And then we can use the get attribute method. And then we just type the name of the attribute. So remember, it was data add, and it's that simple. And just to play things safe, let's wrap this line of code within an if statement. So we only try to add a class if the data add attribute exists for the button element that just got clicked. Because not all of the button elements will have data add, and not all of the elements will have data remove. So in our JavaScript, we can just wrap this line of code within an if statement. So let me just cut and paste this within the if curly brackets. And what is the condition for this if statement? We'll say only if the specific button element that got clicked on, so we used the this keyword, only if it even has that attribute in the first place. So we'll say get attribute data add. Okay, so only if that attribute exists do we want to run this code. And then we can just duplicate these 3 lines for the data remove scenario. So let me copy this, drop down, paste in my clipboard. And this time around, let's just change this from data add to data remove. On this line, after class list, we want to use the remove method instead of the add method. And then we'll just change the attribute name to data remove. So let's save this and test it out in the browser. So if I click the blue eyes button, perfect, the eyes turn blue. And if I click the green eyes button, they're back to green. All right, next, let's add a sad button and a happy button that will control the cat's mouth. So back in our HTML, let's add a third button that reads sad and another button that reads happy. When the sad button gets clicked, we will want to add a class of sad to the SVG element. So on this sad button, let's add a data attribute of data add equals sad. And then for the happy button, we will just remove the sad class. So data remove equals sad. All right, let's save this. And now we just need to write the corresponding CSS that will target the SVG shape that is the mouth. All right, so if we look at the actual SVG code, if I scroll down a bit, here we see a path element that has a class of mouth. Now, if you're working with your own SVG illustration, you'll need to dig through the code a bit to find the specific element that you want to animate or adjust. In this case, I've already done that for us. So our next step is to target this element that has a class of mouth in our CSS. So let's create a new rule. We will begin by selecting the overall SVG element if it has a class of sad. And then we want to look inside it for that path that had a class of mouth. Okay, and to make the cat look sad, we just want to take the mouth and rotate it or flip it vertically so it's upside down. And we'll probably also want to shrink the mouth a bit when it's sad. So back in our CSS, let's begin by shrinking the mouth a bit. So we can use the transform property, and we can use the scale function, and a value of 1 will keep the mouth at its current or natural size. So if we want to shrink the mouth, we could say maybe 0.8. Okay, let's save this and refresh the page, and then click the sad button. We see that the mouth did shrink a bit, but now the positioning of the mouth is way off. The key to fixing this is understanding something named transform origin. So for most HTML content, any content that basically isn't an SVG, when we use transform and scale to shrink or adjust the size of an element, this code would shrink the element towards its own center, right? So for example, if we were to shrink this button, this blue button, if we told it to have a scale of maybe 0.75, it would shrink in from its own center, horizontally and vertically, right? That's how transform works with almost all content on our page. But SVG is different, right? Because the mouth used to be positioned here, so clearly it didn't shrink in on itself towards its own horizontal and vertical center. And this is because with SVG, it always treats the transform origin as the top left corner of the entire illustration, right? So if we think of the entire size of the illustration, when we shrunk the mouth, it's almost as if we just took that layer and dragged it up towards the left, towards this corner. So that's why the mouth is no longer positioned correctly. So to fix this, we just need to tell the mouth shape that its transform origin should be right about here. Now let me show you my favorite way of finding the perfect transform origin value. So I'm just going to right click on the page and click inspect. You can dig through the SVG code to find the path that has a class of mouth. And here we can see that the sad class is being applied to it. And here in my developer tools, I'm just going to click to add another CSS property named transform origin. And let's just start with a value of 1 pixel, 1 pixel. So let me show you how this works. The first value controls the horizontal position. So I can just push the up arrow key on my keyboard to increase this. And if I hold the shift key and press up, it increments by 10. So you can see the mouth is repositioning itself as I do this in real time. Okay, and then the second value controls the vertical positioning. So I can increase that. And while we're experimenting with values, I think we could lower this scale value. Let's try maybe 0.5. Okay, now let's readjust the transform origin to work with that value. So maybe 340 horizontally, and let's go up a bit vertically, or I guess I should say down. Okay, that looks all right. And remember, we also wanted to rotate or flip the mouth vertically so it looks like a frown. So on our transform property, we can just use a function named rotate, and we can give it a value of 180 degrees. And again, you can use the up and down arrow keys on your keyboard to fine-tune this value, but we want 180. And just in case the transform origin concept still isn't clear, I think the best way to understand it visually is to temporarily disable this and set the rotate to only 1 degree. Okay, and now as I increase this rotation value, watch the mouth. You can see that it's pivoting from the very top left corner of the illustration, right? So you can think of the pivot point as the transform origin value or the transform origin position. Okay, so all that we're doing with this transform origin value is providing an X and Y coordinate for the mouth that is right about here. So let me enable the transform origin property again. And now when we change the rotation, you can see that it's pivoting from the center of where the mouth would normally sit, which is exactly what we want. Okay, and then we can just set this back to 180, and there you have it. Okay, now this code that we were just experimenting with only exists in my developer tools. So let me go back to my text editor and write it down for real. So we used a scale of 0.5. We said rotate 180 degrees. And we also had a transform origin of 340 pixels horizontally and 390 pixels vertically. Okay, let's save that. Refresh the page. And now we can successfully switch between sad and happy. Okay, next, let's add buttons that tell the cat to move around and sit still. So in our HTML, scroll back up to the buttons. Let's add a new button that reads move around, and let's add another button that reads sit still. All right, so when this move around button gets clicked, we will add a class of move around to the overall SVG element. So data add move around. And then we will remove that class when this button gets clicked. So data remove move around. Okay, now we just need to jump over to our CSS and write a bit of CSS animation code that will bring the eyes to life, the whiskers to life, and make the overall cat's head move around and look around a bit. Okay, and let's begin with the eyes. So just to refresh your memory, let me jump over to the tab where we have the finished product. And when I click move around, notice the pupils of the eyes start moving. Now back in the HTML of our work in progress version, within our SVG element, the cat's pupils are represented by this G element that has a class of inner eye group. The G of this element stands for group. In SVG, we can group together multiple shapes so that you can move them and manipulate them as a group. So this particular group consists of the green oval and then the tiny white shine circle. So if we want to move that entire group, we don't need to animate both of these ellipse elements. We can just animate the G or the group element. All right, so let's go target this inner eye group class in our CSS. Let's create a new rule. Let's target the overall SVG element only when it has a class of move around. And then we want to look within that for inner eye group. Okay, and we want to add an animation. So we can say animation. In about 10 seconds from now, we will create an animation named move eyes. All right, and we want it to be drawn out over the course of maybe 5 seconds. Okay, now by default, this animation name of move eyes doesn't mean anything to the web browser. We have to manually create an animation named move eyes. So above this rule, let's create a new line and say @keyframes move eyes. Okay, now this is our chance to spell out exactly what the animation should look like. CSS animations are very simple. We basically define how things should look at 0% when the animation first begins. And then we should also define how things should look at the very end of the animation at 100%. So for example, let's say that at the very beginning of the animation, let's move the pupils up and to the left. So we can say transform and then use the translate function. The first value is horizontal, so to move them to the left, maybe 18 pixels, we can say -18. Second value is the vertical positioning, so why don't we pull the pupils up 20 pixels? Okay, so that's the very beginning of the animation. Let's say by the end of the animation, the pupils should move to the right. So we can say transform, use the translate function. So instead of -18 pixels, which will pull them to the left, we can use a positive value of 18 pixels that will push them to the right. And vertically, let's move the eyes back to their neutral vertical position, so just 0. Okay, so if we save this and refresh the page and click the move around button, we see that the eyes move up towards the top left and then move over to the right. And then once the animation is complete, they snap back to their natural positioning. And that's it, the animation is complete. Well, we don't want the animation to ever end. We want the animation to just repeat itself endlessly. So on this line of code, when we assigned the animation, at the end of this line, we can say infinite. Okay, and to test that out, let's change this from 5 seconds to 2 seconds. Okay, so if we refresh and click move around, our animation is much faster. It only takes 2 seconds and it just repeats itself endlessly. Okay, so now our animation is up and running. We just need to fine tune it to make it look a bit smoother. So back in our CSS, why don't we change this from 0% to 20%? So that way, when the animation first begins, the pupils will be in their natural normal position. And then gradually, as the animation plays from 0% to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5% up to 20%, they will gradually move to this up and to the left position. Okay, and then we are also free to add as many intermediate steps to our animation as we please. So we could say at 40% completion of the animation, maybe the eyes get reset back to their natural position. So transform, translate, let's just set them back to 0, 0. And then instead of having this final step be set at 100% completion, why don't we change it to 65%? These are all just arbitrary choices I'm making to make the animation look smooth. It's up to you to choose your own values in the future. But let's say at 65% completion, the eyes should be to the right and pulled back up a bit. So let's save this and test it out. Okay, now that's way too fast, but I think that general movement looks kind of neat. So now if we just slow that down on this line, instead of playing out over 2 seconds, let's change that to maybe 12 seconds. Looks good. Next, let's work on animating the whiskers. So back in our HTML, towards the bottom of our SVG element, we see one group named left whiskers and another group named right whiskers. Let's animate the left set of whiskers first. So over in our CSS, let's create a new rule. We want to target the main SVG element only if it has a class of move around. And then we want to select the left whiskers group. Let's assign it an animation. In just a moment, we can create an animation named left whiskers. Let's have it play out over 3 seconds, and we want it to loop or repeat itself infinitely. All right, now before we go ahead and create an animation named left whiskers, let's first set the transform origin for the whiskers group. So that way, when the whiskers move around, their point of origin or pivot point is right about here, right? Because this is where the whiskers are attached to the cat's body. So we just need to provide the X and Y coordinates of about right here. So let's say 325 pixels from the left and 350 pixels from the top. All right, next, let's create the animation named left whiskers. So above this line, let's say keyframes, left whiskers. How about at 20% completion of the animation, we rotate the whiskers. So transform and then use the rotate function. And let's rotate them 5 degrees clockwise. And then let's say about 60% completion of the animation, we want to rotate them the other direction. So transform, rotate, -5 degrees. Let's save this and test it out. Okay, cool. So notice the whiskers are moving around. Next, let's set up a slightly different animation for the right-hand set of whiskers. So I'm just going to copy and paste all of this left-hand whiskers code and then paste it in. Okay, so let's change this duplicate copy to right whiskers. And my goal here is that I don't want the whiskers on the right to move exactly the same as the whiskers on the left. I want to give the illusion that they're both moving randomly. So for the right-hand set of whiskers, let's change this to 5% through the animation. And maybe we'll say -2 degrees. And then let's change this to 90% completion through the animation. We'll change this to maybe 7 degrees. And let's be sure to change this selector to right whiskers and also update its animation name that it's using to right whiskers. Okay, let's save that. Refresh it, click move around. Perfect, and now we can see that the different sets of whiskers move independently of each other. All right, now we're almost done with the project. For our final task, let's have the entire cat head move around. To do that, we can use 3D rotation. So back in our CSS, let's create a new rule. Let's select the overall SVG element only if it has a class of move around. And this time we don't need to look for any other elements inside the SVG. We want to animate the parent SVG element itself. So let's assign it an animation. In just a moment, we can create an animation named move. Let's have it play out over the course of 8 seconds, and let's have it loop, so infinite. All right, now let's go ahead and create the animation named move. So we'll say keyframes move. And let's start out at 40% through the animation. We can rotate the head in a 3-dimensional fashion. So we can say transform, only instead of using the rotate function, we can use a function named rotate y. So let's say 25 degrees, and let's test that out. Now it's subtle, but notice that the cat head is sort of rotating or pivoting horizontally in a three-dimensional fashion. And if we change this to rotate x, notice now the cat head is rotating vertically in a three-dimensional fashion. So we can use those two functions, rotate x and rotate y, to create all sorts of diagonal movements, and it will look pretty natural. So at 40%, let's say rotate y is 25 degrees and rotate x is 10 degrees. Okay, let's also say that at maybe 20% completion of the animation, rotate y 10 degrees, rotate x 10 degrees. Let's say 60% completion, rotate y, let's say negative 10 degrees, and rotate x negative 10 degrees. And finally, at 85% completion, negative 10 degrees and negative 16 degrees. Again, these are all just arbitrary random numbers I'm choosing. I want the animation to look natural, so there's always a bit of experimentation involved, but let's save that and test it out. Okay, so that looks okay, but I think we can improve it a bit. So this is where something called perspective comes into play. So check this out. In our HTML, let's wrap the SVG element inside a parent div. So here's the SVG. Above it, let's create a div named SVG container. And then down at the very bottom of the SVG element, let me close out that div. Okay, and now back in our CSS, let's target that container div. So we can say SVG container, and then we can use the perspective property, which is super useful when you're using 3D rotations. This property lets us say how close we are or how far away we are from the object that is rotating. So for example, if I use a relatively small value here of maybe 150 pixels, you can see the rotation looks very extreme. It's like we're a tiny little insect and we're only a centimeter away from the object that is being rotated. Okay, so if we use a larger value here, like maybe 3000 pixels, now it's as if we are farther away from the object that is rotating, so the movements don't look as extreme. All right, so you are free to experiment with perspective values, but in this case, I think a nice happy medium is a distance or a perspective of 1000 pixels. It's not too extreme, it's not too subtle, I think it's just right. And that's actually going to bring this lesson to a close. I know this was a long video, so thank you so much for sticking with me until the end. I hope you feel like you learned something, and I encourage you to experiment with your own vector illustrations and animations. Anyways, I will see you in a new video next week, and until then, take care. If you haven't already, be sure to check out my new premium course where we learn about Git, GitHub, Node, NPM, object-oriented JavaScript, and a bunch of modern tools and best practices that will get you job ready in no time. As always, there's a link to it in the description.